February 14, 1943 brought thunder to the Tunisian valleys as German panzers crashed through American positions like wolves through a broken fence. The Battle of Kasserine Pass had begun, and with it, the bloodiest lesson the United States Army would learn in North Africa. General Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox, watched his Africa Corps tear through the green American forces with methodical precision, and in those brutal days he made a judgment that would echo through military history. The American soldiers stumbled backward through the rocky defiles, leaving behind burning tanks, abandoned equipment, and the bodies of young men who had crossed an ocean to fight tyranny. They were clerks and farmhands, college boys and factory workers, thrust suddenly into mechanized warfare against the most experienced desert fighters in the world. Rommel observed their confusion, their tactical mistakes, their hesitation under fire, and he penned words that would haunt and ultimately motivate an entire generation. These Americans, he suggested, were simply not ready for modern warfare. The German general's assessment was not without foundation. The United States Second Corps under Major General Lloyd Fredendall had suffered catastrophic losses. Nearly 6,000 American casualties littered the Tunisian landscape, along with hundreds of destroyed vehicles and tons of abandoned supplies. Fredendall himself had commanded from a bunker 70 miles behind the front lines, connected by elaborate tunnels that his engineers spent more time constructing than preparing defensive positions. The coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery had been abysmal, reminiscent of amateur hour rather than professional military operations. Field Marshal Rommel's own reports to Berlin dripped with contempt. The Americans scattered too easily, he noted. Their officers lacked tactical flexibility. Their equipment, while abundant, was handled with inexperience that bordered on incompetence. After years of fighting the British Eighth Army in the desert, Rommel had developed a grudging respect for his enemies. But these Americans seemed different, softer somehow, as if the comfortable life across the Atlantic had left them unprepared for the harsh realities of total war. Yet, even in defeat, something stirred within the American ranks that Rommel failed to recognize. As the survivors of Kasserine Pass retreated through the mountain passes, bloody and beaten, they carried with them not just shame, but fury. The sting of humiliation burned deeper than any wound. These were men raised on stories of American exceptionalism, of citizen soldiers who had helped win the Great War, of a nation that had never known military defeat on such a scale. The psychological impact of Kasserine Pass rippled through every level of command, from privates huddled in foxholes to generals pacing in headquarters tents. According to historical accounts documented in the United States Army's official records, the immediate aftermath of Kasserine Pass triggered a transformation that military historians would study for generations. Within days of the defeat, a reshuffling began that would alter the entire character of American forces in North Africa. Fredendall was relieved of command, his bunker-building debacle becoming a cautionary tale in military academies. In his place came a man whose name would become synonymous with American military excellence, Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr. March 6, 1943 marked the day George Patton arrived at the headquarters of the Second Corps with pearl-handled revolvers on his hips and fire in his eyes. The general stepped out of his command car into a camp that reeked of defeatism, where soldiers shuffled about with slovenly uniforms and defeated expressions. Patton's jaw tightened as he surveyed the scene, and in that moment he made a decision that would ripple through every tent, every foxhole, every tank crew in the American sector. The transformation began with the smallest details. Patton immediately instituted regulations that seemed almost comically strict to combat veterans. Soldiers would shave daily. Helmets would be worn at all times. Neckties would be properly knotted even in the desert heat, and a $50 fine would be levied against any man caught without proper uniform. Officers who had grown comfortable behind the lines suddenly found themselves conducting inspections with the same intensity they once reserved for training exercises back in the States. Men grumbled and cursed Patton's name, but something fundamental was shifting beneath the surface of these seemingly petty regulations. The psychology behind Patton's methods ran deeper than mere military pageantry. He understood that an army that looked defeated would fight defeated. Discipline in appearance bred discipline in action. When a soldier took pride in his uniform, he took pride in his unit, and when he took pride in his unit, he fought harder to maintain its honor. The bedraggled survivors of Kasserine Pass needed to see themselves not as victims but as warriors, and Patton's relentless focus on military bearing began that transformation. But Patton's revolution extended far beyond spit and polish. He immediately reorganized the command structure, placing aggressive, competent officers in key positions while sending the incompetent and the timid to rear echelon duties. He personally visited frontline positions, often arriving in areas still under artillery fire, demonstrating the kind of leadership that inspired men to follow him into hell itself. His profane speeches became legendary, stripping away any romantic notions about war, while simultaneously instilling a fierce confidence in American superiority. The training intensified with brutal efficiency. Patton recognized that the debacle at Kasserine Pass stemmed not from cowardice, but from inexperience and poor preparation. American tank crews had faced German panzers without understanding the tactical principles of armored warfare. Infantry had advanced without proper artillery support or reconnaissance. Communications between units had broken down under pressure, leaving isolated pockets to be destroyed piecemeal by a coordinated enemy. All of these failures could be corrected, but only through rigorous, realistic training. Tank commanders found themselves in intensive courses on German armor tactics, learning to recognize the silhouettes of enemy vehicles at distance, understanding the vulnerabilities of Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks, and mastering the techniques of hull-down firing positions. Infantry units drilled endlessly on combined arms tactics, coordinating their movements with armor and artillery until the complex ballet of modern warfare became second nature. Artillery batteries practiced rapid displacement and fire missions until they could deliver accurate fire support within minutes of receiving coordinates. The desert itself became a vast training ground where American forces rehearsed the lessons written in blood at Kasserine Pass. Patton insisted on live-fire exercises that simulated combat conditions as closely as possible without actually killing his own men. Units maneuvered against each other in mock battles that tested their ability to maintain cohesion under pressure, to adapt to changing tactical situations, and to exploit enemy weaknesses with the speed and aggression that modern warfare demanded. The soldiers who had fled in panic just weeks earlier began to move with the confidence of professional warriors. March 17, 1943 dawned with a peculiar tension hanging over the American positions near El Guetter, a small Tunisian town nestled among rocky hills and ancient olive groves. Intelligence reports indicated that the German 10th Panzer Division was moving toward American lines, intent on replicating their success at Kasserine Pass, but the force waiting for them bore little resemblance to the disorganized units that had crumbled under Rommel's assault just weeks earlier. These Americans had something to prove, and they were spoiling for the chance to prove it. Patton's tactical dispositions reflected hard lessons learned and carefully studied. Rather than spreading his forces thin across a wide front as Fredendall had done, he concentrated his strength at key defensive positions with clear fields of fire. Tank destroyer battalions positioned their guns in carefully camouflaged positions along likely avenues of approach, their crews drilled to perfection on the techniques of ambush warfare. Infantry dug in with proper overhead cover and interlocking fields of fire, turning the landscape into a killing ground for any armor foolish enough to advance without infantry support. The German attack came with the dawn, columns of panzers rolling forward with the same confidence that had carried them through Poland, France, and across North Africa. The thunder of their engines echoed off the hills as they advanced toward what they expected to be another easy victory against inexperienced Americans. But this time the Americans did not run. They held their positions with grim determination, waiting for the perfect moment to spring their trap. American artillery opened fire with devastating accuracy, having already registered their targets during the night. Shells rained down on the advancing German columns with a precision that spoke of countless hours of training and careful preparation. Tank destroyers held their fire with remarkable discipline, allowing the panzers to close to point-blank range before unleashing a storm of armor-piercing rounds. German tanks began exploding in fountains of flame and smoke as American gunners found their marks with deadly efficiency. The German commanders, accustomed to American incompetence, suddenly found themselves fighting an entirely different army. Their tactical radio networks buzzed with confused reports as coordinated American counterattacks hit their flanks, as their supply lines came under accurate artillery fire, as their carefully planned advance dissolved into chaos. The 10th Panzer Division, blooded veterans of countless battles, reeled backward under the ferocity of American resistance. These were not the same soldiers who had fled at Kasserine Pass. For 3 days, the battle raged around El Getter as German forces repeatedly attempted to break through American lines. Each assault met with coordinated, disciplined resistance that would have seemed impossible just a month earlier. American tank crews maneuvered with newfound confidence, using terrain to their advantage and working in coordination with infantry and artillery. Fighter bombers of the Army Air Forces roared overhead, striking German positions with increasing effectiveness as air-ground coordination improved dramatically. The cost was high, measured in American blood and burning vehicles, but the soldiers of Second Corps held their ground and more. They counterattacked when opportunities presented themselves, seizing key terrain and inflicting casualties on an enemy that had considered them inferior. When German forces finally withdrew on March 23, they left behind the wreckage of their assault and a grudging new respect for American fighting ability. The Battle of El Getter had announced to the world that the United States Army had learned its lessons and was ready to fight. April 1, 1943 found the workshops and supply depots of North Africa buzzing with activity as American forces not only absorbed tactical lessons but also adapted their equipment and doctrine to match battlefield realities. The defeat at Kasserine Pass had exposed critical weaknesses in American weaponry and organization, and the response demonstrated the industrial and innovative capacity that would become America's hallmark throughout the war. Engineers, officers, and enlisted men collaborated to transform theory into practice at a pace that left observers stunned. The American Sherman tank, derided by some as inferior to German panzers, underwent rapid field modifications that improved its combat effectiveness. Crews welded additional armor plates onto vulnerable spots, added sandbags for extra protection, and modified their tactics to compensate for the Sherman's lighter armor and less powerful gun. What the Sherman lacked in individual capability, American forces learned to overcome through superior numbers, better logistics, and more aggressive tactics. Tank commanders developed techniques of massed attack and mutual support that turned the Sherman's weaknesses into manageable challenges. Artillery coordination, which had been nearly non-existent at Kasserine Pass, evolved into an American strength that would dominate battlefields for the remainder of the war. Forward observers embedded with infantry units perfected their ability to call down accurate fire with minimal delay. The famous time-on-target technique emerged, where multiple artillery batteries would time their fire so that shells from different locations arrived simultaneously, giving no warning and no chance for enemy troops to take cover. This innovation turned American artillery into a devastating force multiplier that German commanders learned to fear. Communications improvements proved equally crucial to American success. The chaos of Kasserine Pass had stemmed partly from broken communications that left units isolated and commanders blind to battlefield developments. New radio procedures, better equipment maintenance, and redundant communication systems ensured that information flowed smoothly up and down the chain of command. American forces developed a flexibility in response that allowed them to react quickly to changing situations, turning the tide in battles that might otherwise have been lost. Intelligence gathering and analysis underwent a complete overhaul as American forces recognized that knowing the enemy was half the battle. Reconnaissance units pushed deeper into enemy territory, gathering information on German positions, movements, and capabilities. Aerial photography became increasingly sophisticated, providing commanders with detailed maps and target information. Captured documents were analyzed for insights into German tactics and organization. The naive assumption that American courage alone would suffice gave way to a more professional understanding that wars were won through superior intelligence as much as superior firepower. The infantry itself evolved in response to combat experience. Squad tactics became more sophisticated, with clear roles for riflemen, automatic weapons crews, and support elements. American soldiers learned to move across open ground using fire and maneuver, techniques that minimized casualties while maintaining momentum. They practiced house-to-house fighting, mine detection, and the coordination of infantry armored teams until these skills became instinctive. The farm boys and clerks who had stumbled at Kasserine Pass were transforming into skilled combat soldiers. Behind all these improvements lay an organizational culture that encouraged innovation and rewarded success. Unlike some armies where rigid doctrine stifled adaptation, American forces fostered a culture where junior officers and even enlisted men could propose improvements and see them implemented. Good ideas bubbled up from the front lines to headquarters, where flexible commanders like Patton and his eventual successor, Omar Bradley, eagerly incorporated lessons learned into training and operations. This organizational adaptability would prove to be one of America's greatest advantages. July 10, 1943 witnessed the largest amphibious invasion in history to that date as American and British forces stormed ashore on Sicily's beaches under a full moon and turbulent seas. Operation Husky brought 160,000 Allied troops crashing onto Axis-held territory. And among those forces were American divisions that had cut their teeth in Tunisia. The island campaign would prove that the lessons of North Africa had been thoroughly absorbed and that American forces could now execute complex operations with a professionalism that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. The 7th Army, commanded by Patton, landed on Sicily's southern coast with a confidence born of hard-won experience. Gone were the hesitations and confusions that had plagued earlier operations. Beachmasters organized the chaos of amphibious landings with practiced efficiency, moving men and materiel inland with minimal delay. Combat engineers cleared obstacles and established supply routes while infantry pushed rapidly inland to seize key objectives. The coordination between air, naval, and ground forces reflected countless hours of planning and training, transforming what could have been a disaster into a remarkable success. American forces faced not only German defenders but also Italian troops who fought with varying degrees of enthusiasm. The strategic situation was complex, requiring diplomatic sensitivity alongside military aggression. American commanders demonstrated a growing sophistication in their approach, using psychological warfare, civil affairs units, and carefully calibrated force to achieve their objectives. They learned to distinguish between fanatic defenders who required destruction and demoralized conscripts who could be induced to surrender, applying appropriate tactics to each situation. The race across Sicily showcased American mobile warfare capabilities that Rommel would have found unrecognizable from Kasserine Pass. Patton drove his divisions forward with relentless energy, covering ground at speeds that astonished both allies and enemies. The 7th Army's advance to Palermo, and then along the northern coast to Messina, demonstrated that American forces had mastered the art of exploitation, knowing when to push hard and when to consolidate gains. Supply units performed miracles, keeping forward elements fed, fueled, and armed despite extended lines of communication and difficult terrain. Yet Sicily also revealed continuing challenges that tempered American triumphalism. Friendly fire incidents, most tragically the shooting down of American transport aircraft by Allied naval vessels, demonstrated that coordination issues persisted despite improvements. Some units still showed hesitation when facing determined resistance, requiring vigorous leadership to maintain momentum. Relations between American and British forces occasionally grew tense as national rivalries complicated operational planning. These problems were natural growing pains of a rapidly expanding military, but they reminded commanders that perfection remained elusive. The campaign's conclusion in mid-August, with Axis forces successfully evacuating to the Italian mainland, provided both satisfaction and frustration. American forces had proven they could fight and win major campaigns, liberating an entire island in just 38 days. Casualties had been far lighter than in Tunisia, reflecting improved tactics and coordination. But the escape of experienced German divisions meant they would fight another day, extending the war in Italy and costing more Allied lives. Strategic success required not just tactical victory, but also the decisive destruction of enemy forces. September 9th, 1943 brought American forces splashing ashore at Salerno on the Italian mainland. beginning a campaign that would test everything they had learned in North Africa and Sicily. The Italian campaign proved to be a grinding, brutal affair that lacked the dramatic breakthroughs of other theaters, but nevertheless demonstrated the steady competence American forces had achieved. From Salerno to Anzio, from Monte Cassino to the Gothic Line, American soldiers fought with a professional skill that would have been unthinkable at Kasserine Pass. The Fifth Army under Lieutenant General Mark Clark faced some of the most difficult terrain imaginable for modern warfare. The Italian peninsula's mountainous spine channeled operations into narrow valleys where German defenders held every advantage. Ancient stone villages became fortresses, rivers became obstacles requiring elaborate engineering solutions, and winter weather turned roads into quagmires. Yet American forces adapted to these challenges with impressive flexibility, developing mountain warfare techniques and learning to fight in conditions far removed from the desert training that had prepared them for North Africa. Infantry divisions that had once crumbled under pressure now showed remarkable staying power in sustained combat. The 36th Infantry Division, badly mauled at the Rapido River crossing, absorbed its losses and continued fighting with grim determination. The 34th Infantry Division earned the nickname Red Bulls for its tenacious attacks against German mountain positions. These citizen soldiers demonstrated that American troops could match German defenders in the qualities that mattered most in infantry combat: endurance, courage, and small unit initiative. The campaigns in Italy also showcased growing sophistication in combined arms operations and joint planning. Air power became increasingly effective as techniques improved for close air support and interdiction. Fighter bombers worked in coordination with ground forces to isolate battlefields and destroy enemy logistics. Heavy bombers struck strategic targets throughout northern Italy and into southern Germany. Naval gunfire supported amphibious operations and provided additional artillery support to ground forces. The integration of these diverse capabilities reflected organizational maturity that came from experience and systematic improvement. Beyond Italy, American forces were preparing for even greater challenges. In England, the build-up for Operation Overlord proceeded with meticulous planning that incorporated every lesson learned in the Mediterranean theater. Training centers in the United States churned out new divisions that benefited from battle-tested doctrine, and experienced cadres of non-commissioned officers and junior officers rotated back from combat zones. The industrial mobilization reached its peak, producing weapons and equipment in quantities that seemed almost wasteful but which ensured American forces would never lack material superiority. The transformation extended to the Pacific Theater as well, where American forces fought a very different war against Japan, but applied the same principles of adaptation and improvement. Island-hopping campaigns demonstrated American amphibious capabilities and the ability to sustain operations across vast oceanic distances. Marines and Army divisions perfected the brutal art of jungle warfare and island assault, taking horrific casualties but never wavering from their objectives. The same national characteristics that had enabled recovery from Kasserine Pass drove success from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. By spring of 1944, the United States military bore no resemblance to the force that had entered combat in North Africa. An organization that had numbered just over 170,000 soldiers in 1939 now fielded millions of men under arms, organized into scores of divisions and hundreds of smaller units. More importantly, this vast force operated with efficiency and effectiveness that rivaled or exceeded any military in the world. The question was no longer whether American forces could fight, but rather how quickly they could achieve final victory. May 7th, 1945 arrived with church bells ringing across Europe as Germany surrendered unconditionally, ending a war that had transformed the world and demonstrated beyond any doubt that Rommel's early assessment of American fighting ability had been catastrophically wrong. The journey from Kasserine Pass to victory had taken just over 2 years, but in that brief span, the United States military had evolved from a green, inexperienced force into arguably the most effective fighting machine the world had ever seen. The transformation stood as testament to American adaptability, industrial might, and the determination of citizen soldiers who refused to accept defeat. The numbers told part of the story. From North Africa to Sicily, from Normandy to the Rhine, American forces had fought and won against the Wehrmacht's best divisions. They had liberated France, crossed the Rhine, and driven deep into the heart of Germany itself. American industry had produced weapons, vehicles, and supplies in quantities that staggered the imagination, while American logistics had kept armies supplied across 2 oceans and multiple continents. But statistics alone could not capture the essence of what had occurred. What Rommel had witnessed at Kasserine Pass was not inherent American weakness, but rather the growing pains of a democracy transforming itself into a military superpower. The soldiers who fled through those Tunisian passes were not cowards but inexperienced men thrust into combat against battle-hardened veterans. Their failure was not of courage but of preparation, and America's response to that failure revealed the nation's true character. Rather than making excuses or accepting limitations, American military leadership ruthlessly analyzed mistakes, implemented corrections, and drove improvement with relentless intensity. The transformation extended beyond mere tactical proficiency to encompass a comprehensive system of warfare that leveraged every American advantage. Superior logistics ensured that American soldiers were better fed, better supplied, and better equipped than their enemies. Air superiority meant that American ground forces operated under protective umbrellas, while enemy movements occurred under constant threat from above. Naval power projected American strength across vast distances, landing armies on hostile shores with a precision that seemed almost routine by war's end. These capabilities did not emerge from nowhere, but rather from systematic effort to turn American industrial and organizational strengths into military advantages. Perhaps most remarkably, the American military maintained its character as a citizen force even as it achieved professional excellence. The soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who won the war were not professional warriors, but ordinary Americans who learned to fight, won their battles, and then returned home to resume civilian lives. They brought to military service qualities that professional armies often lacked: creativity, individual initiative, technical aptitude, and a democratic spirit that fostered innovation rather than blind obedience. These citizen soldiers proved that free men could fight as effectively as any indoctrinated conscripts. Rommel himself, had he lived to see war's end, might have recognized his error. The Desert Fox was captured by Allied forces and later forced to commit suicide by Hitler's regime in October 1944, after being implicated in the plot to assassinate the Führer. He died believing himself a patriot serving his country, but history would remember him as a talented commander who fought for an evil cause. His early assessment of American forces, while understandable given the circumstances, revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what America represented. The legacy of Kasserine Pass lived on long after the war's end, serving as a reminder that initial defeat need not determine final outcome. Military academies studied the battle as an example of how to recover from disaster, how to learn from mistakes, and how to transform weakness into strength. The veterans who survived that baptism of fire carried with them lessons that shaped American military doctrine for generations. They proved that given proper leadership, training, and equipment, American soldiers could match any force on earth. In the final analysis, Rommel was wrong, not because he misread what he saw at Kasserine Pass, but because he failed to understand what Americans could become when properly led and motivated. He witnessed the beginning of America's military learning curve but did not live to see where that curve led. The United States Army that accepted Germany's surrender in May 1945 bore almost no resemblance to the force that had stumbled through Tunisia in February 1943. That transformation, achieved in just over 2 years of brutal warfare, stands as one of the most remarkable military achievements in history and the ultimate answer to Rommel's premature judgment.